Fix the Court is a nonprofit watchdog that tries to make the federal judiciary more accountable to the people. Yesterday, it came out with a report that says since January of 2004, Supreme Court justices accepted nearly $6.5 million in gifts from assorted millionaires and billionaires. Fix the Court says much of their calculations are based on the groundbreaking work of ProPublica, which uncovered Justice Alito's free fishing trips and flights, and, of course, Clarence Thomas, who has accepted a boatload of freebies from right-wing donors who often have business before the court. Kathleen Quieton, I don't know if I'm pronouncing her last name properly, but Catherine Quieton over at Raw Story took the time to pore over Fix the Court's numbers. And she writes that Clarence Thomas's freebies and gifts come to $4,042,286. Of the $6.5 million worth of gifts that were given to the Supreme Court over a 20-year period, Clarence Thomas got a little more than $4 million. She then writes that if you take an even closer look at his disclosures, Clarence Thomas's share of gifts might actually come to $5,879,796. I'm in the wrong business. I should have been a Supreme Court justice. Clarence Thomas was nominated to the Supreme Court by President George Herbert Walker Bush after Thurgood Marshall announced his retirement, citing poor health. Thurgood Marshall was the first black person to sit on the Supreme Court. He was appointed by Lyndon Johnson in 1967, more than 100 years after the Civil War. It took more than 100 years after the Civil War to finally get a black judge on the Supreme Court. But it wasn't just any black judge. Thurgood Marshall in 1954 argued for the plaintiffs, the Browns, whose daughter was refused entry into the closest public school in Topeka, Kansas, because she was black. They forced her, because she was black, to take a bus to an all-black school miles away. Thurgood Marshall was an attorney for the NAACP, not a judge. He didn't decide Brown v. Board of Education. He won it. He won the landmark case that single-handedly put an end to separate but equal. And that decision, 70 years ago, this year, was supposed to put an end to school segregation. One could argue, however, America's public schools are as segregated as they were 70 years ago, and that would be because of people like Clarence Thomas, who was given Thurgood Marshall's seat. President George Herbert Walker Bush understood that Marshall's seat had to be filled by an African American. But George Herbert Walker Bush was a Republican, and he didn't like Thurgood Marshall. So he nominated Clarence Thomas, who has spent the past 30 years staining Thurgood Marshall's seat, trying to reverse everything Thurgood Marshall fought for, from the Voting Rights Act to affirmative action. Clarence Thomas got Thurgood Marshall's seat because he was black. And yet Thomas last year voted to get rid of affirmative action on college campuses, even though he admits he has been the beneficiary of affirmative action throughout his career, including getting accepted into Yale Law School. He says, I got into Yale Law School because of affirmative action. Clarence Thomas, a former Black Panther and a recipient of affirmative action, decided to reinvent both himself and American history. What makes this so abhorrent is Clarence Thomas sits in Thurgood Marshall's seat.